There's a specific kind of silence that only happens when something inside you has already ended, but nobody told your conscious mind yet. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, the silence of a machine that used to run constantly and has, without warning, gone completely still. You notice it first as an absence, the drive that used to pull you out of bed, the low hum of ambition, the reflexive reaching for the next thing, all of it just gone. And the terrifying part isn't that it stopped. The terrifying part is that somewhere underneath the fear of it, something in you is almost relieved. That's where I was. Not dramatically. That's the part no one tells you about these moments. They don't announce themselves. There was no breakdown, no rock-bottom scene, no single event I could point to and say, that's where it changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that has no texture to it. Gray light through a window, a half-finished cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, the faint sound of traffic outside that I'd stopped hearing weeks before because it had become indistinguishable from the inside of my own head. I was sitting at my desk. I had work I was supposed to be doing, and I just sat there, completely empty. And what scared me wasn't the emptiness. What scared me was that I couldn't remember what I'd been so full of before. I want you to understand what kind of person I was before this happened, because it matters for everything that comes after. I was functional in all the ways that count as success from the outside looking in. I had structure. I had a system. I had what most people would call a clear enough sense of direction. I wasn't the kind of person who drifted. I was the kind of person who had a plan, and then a backup plan, and then a rational explanation for why those plans were reasonable. I'd built a version of myself that was consistent, legible, and quietly exhausting to maintain. Not because it was dishonest exactly, but because it had been assembled from the outside in, from what made sense to other people rather than from anything I could locate inside myself and call true. And underneath all of that, underneath the functioning, the planning, the carefully managed presentation of a person who had things together, there was this frequency. I don't have a better word for it. A low, persistent hum, not loud enough to be disruptive, not quiet enough to ignore. Like a note played just below the range where you can identify it, but you feel it in your chest anyway, slightly wrong, slightly off, like a door that's almost closed but not quite. I'd been living with that hum for so long, I'd started to think it was just what being a person felt like, that everyone had some version of it, and the mature thing to do was to not make a big deal of it. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't find out how wrong for a while yet. If what I'm describing sounds familiar to you, if there's something in this that lands with a recognition you didn't expect, I want you to stay with that. Don't explain it away. Don't rationalize it into something smaller than it is. Because what I've learned is that recognition is never accidental. It's always the part of you that already knows something, trying to get the attention of the part of you that's still pretending not to. If this is landing, let it land. And if you're finding this transmission valuable, please take 2 seconds and subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need it most, and I think you probably know someone who does. The thing about that Tuesday is that nothing externally changed. I got up eventually. I finished the work. I moved through the rest of the day with the mechanical competence of someone who has done the same sequence of actions enough times that the body handles it without input from anything deeper. But something had shifted below the surface. Some process had started that I couldn't name yet, like the first, almost imperceptible movement of a very large, very slow thing beginning to change direction. I've talked to enough people since then to know this moment has a shape. It's not unique to me. The details are different for everyone. The Tuesday afternoon is my version. Yours might be a commute, a conversation that died in the middle, a morning where you woke up and lay there staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes before you could locate a reason to move. But the structure underneath is consistent. Something that had been running on automatic finally missed a beat. And in that missing beat, a space opened up. Not comfortable, not peaceful, just open. And in that open space, for the first time in longer than you can account for, you heard something. Not a voice. Not a message. More like a frequency you'd been tuned away from for years, just barely within range again. And the question that follows is the one I couldn't stop sitting with, long after that Tuesday afternoon had dissolved into all the other days. What exactly had I been so carefully tuned away from? And more importantly, who had done the tuning? The crack didn't come from something big. It came from a book I almost didn't pick up. I need to set the scene properly because the details matter here. It was maybe 3 weeks after that Tuesday. I was in one of those second-hand bookshops, the kind with narrow aisles and shelves so packed that books lean against each other at odd angles like tired people on a long commute. I wasn't looking for anything specific. Honestly, I was just killing time before meeting a friend for coffee, doing that aimless browsing thing where your hands move through spines without your brain being particularly involved. And then my hands stopped. Not because I made it stop. It just stopped. On this thin, worn paperback with a faded cover that I couldn't even read properly in the dim light of that aisle. I pulled it out, looked at it. It meant nothing to me. I almost put it back. And then something, I genuinely cannot tell you what, made me open it to a random page in the middle. The sentence I landed on was not profound in the way that sentences get described as profound. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't a quote you'd put on a card. It was a single, plain, almost clinical observation about how most people spend their entire lives responding to a version of reality that was handed to them before they were old enough to evaluate it. That was it. That was the whole sentence, essentially. And I stood there in that aisle, with the faint smell of old paper and dust around me, with the sound of someone at the front of the shop asking about a specific title, and I felt the crack open. Not metaphorically. I felt it physically, somewhere in the upper chest, like a seam giving way under pressure that had been building for a very long time. I bought the book. I didn't meet my friend for coffee. I texted an apology, walked to a bench in a small park nearby, and sat there for 2 hours reading. Not because the book was so extraordinary, but because something in me had recognized something, and I couldn't close the distance between me and that recognition fast enough. It was the feeling of remembering something important that you had no conscious memory of ever knowing. And that feeling, once you've had it, is genuinely impossible to unfeel. It changes the texture of everything that comes after it. That's the crack I'm talking about. That's what I meant when I said at the start that none of this began when you think it began. Because that afternoon in the bookshop wasn't the beginning either. It was just the first moment the pressure became visible. The seam had been weakening for years. The crack was simply when the light finally got in. Now here's the part that surprised me most about what came after that, and this is important, so stay with me. I thought that kind of recognition, that kind of sudden clarity about something you'd been half-consciously avoiding, would feel like relief. I expected it to feel like putting something down that you'd been carrying too long, and there was some of that. But what I wasn't prepared for was the other thing that arrived alongside it, this quiet, creeping discomfort. Because the moment you really see something clearly, you lose the option of convincingly pretending you can't see it. And that's not always welcome. That's not always the feeling you wanted. I watched what happened in the people around me when I started talking, carefully, cautiously, about some of what I was beginning to notice. And I saw it split almost cleanly down the middle. Some people, when they heard it, went somewhere sharp and defensive, not because they disagreed exactly, but because the thing I was describing bumped up against something they'd made a private arrangement with, some comfortable agreement with themselves that this particular door would stay closed. And you could see it in their face, the rapid recalibration, the way the conversation suddenly needed to be somewhere else. The other half went quiet, in the good way. The way people go quiet when something lands in a place they recognize but hadn't named yet. I started to understand that recognition, real recognition, is a kind of gate, not a dramatic one. No thunder, no ceremony, just a moment where the path splits and you either keep walking toward what you've seen or you turn around and invest energy in forgetting. And what I noticed, with a precision that still surprises me, is that the turning around option is more expensive than it looks, because you don't actually forget. You just spend resources managing the not forgetting. You get good at looking at certain angles where the thing isn't visible. You develop habits that keep your attention sufficiently occupied, and you call it moving on. But underneath it, that frequency is still running. That low hum I described before. Only now it's slightly louder, because now part of you knows exactly what it's the sound of. I chose not to turn around, not because I was brave, because even then, even at the very beginning of whatever this was, something in me understood that the cost of looking away had already exceeded the cost of looking. And that understanding, small and unsentimental as it was, turned out to be the gate. Not a feeling, not a revelation, just a quiet, almost reluctant decision to stay present with what I'd seen. What I didn't know yet was what that decision was going to cost me before it gave me anything back. Every serious tradition that ever tried to preserve something true eventually hit the same problem. How do you pass on something that can only be understood from the inside? I didn't come to that question through any formal study. I came to it through a strange few months of noticing that the same structural idea kept appearing in places that had no business agreeing with each other. It started with the book from the bench, which led to another book, which led to a series of late evenings where I'd find myself at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, reading something written by someone who had been dead for centuries, and feeling with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, like they were describing something I had personally experienced that week. Not metaphorically, with an accuracy that made me put the book down more than once, and just sit there in the quiet of the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound, thinking, how did they know that? The Stoics had a concept they called the inner citadel, the idea that there is a part of the self that external events cannot reach unless you hand them the key. I'd read about it before in a surface kind of way, the way you absorb ideas from a summary without really letting them land. But now, sitting in that kitchen, having chosen not to turn away from what I'd seen, I felt it differently, not as philosophy, as something structural, as a description of an actual thing that either exists in a person or doesn't, and can be built or eroded depending on what you practice. And then I came across the Sufi concept of the polished mirror, the idea that the heart, in its natural state, reflects clearly, but accumulates a kind of residue from fear and habit and inherited patterns until it reflects back a distorted image that you mistake for reality, and that the whole project is not to add something, but to remove what's obscuring what was always there. And then the Hermetic principle of correspondence. As within, so without. The structure of your inner world and the structure of your perceived outer world are not separate systems with a causal relationship between them. They are the same system described from two different positions. I want to be careful here, because I am not someone who came to any of this with the kind of credulous enthusiasm that turns ideas into a new religion. I'm genuinely skeptical by nature. I have a low tolerance for the kind of spiritual content that uses impressive-sounding frameworks as decoration for something that doesn't actually hold up under pressure. But what struck me about these traditions was precisely that they weren't asking me to believe anything. They were pointing at something observable, something you could test against your own direct experience if you were willing to pay close enough attention. And that was the thing that kept me at the kitchen table night after night. Not faith, curiosity, the same skeptical, slightly impatient curiosity that I'd applied to everything else that had ever held my attention seriously. And the more precisely I looked, the more the map held. What I was slowly assembling, without yet having words for it, was the understanding that these traditions weren't different beliefs about the same ultimate truth. They were different measurement instruments aimed at the same phenomenon, and that phenomenon was something that every one of them agreed on in their own language. That perception, trained and refined and stripped of the noise that accumulates through living an unexamined life, becomes something qualitatively different from ordinary thinking. Not mystical in the supernatural sense, but functionally different, faster, more accurate, operating on a layer of pattern that analytical thought accesses slowly and partially at best. I didn't fully trust this yet. I want to be honest about that. There was still a part of me that was watching the whole process with its arms crossed, waiting for the point where it would collapse into wishful thinking. But the collapse didn't come, and that was, in its own quiet way, more interesting than any revelation could have been. Now I need to tell you about the years I'd been reading as failure. because this is the part that actually changed everything. And it's the part that's hardest to explain without sounding like you're just repackaging a loss as a lesson. I know how that sounds. I've been skeptical of it myself, so bear with me. There were roughly 4 years in my life that I had privately filed under wasted, a period where I had thrown significant energy into a direction that ultimately went nowhere. Not dramatically, not with any clean ending, just a slow compression of possibilities until one day I looked up and the thing I'd been building toward had quietly ceased to be viable. And I had processed this, or thought I had, through the standard sequence: disappointment, adjustment, the construction of a new plan. I thought I'd moved on. What I hadn't done, and this is what the kitchen table evenings eventually showed me, was actually look at what had happened in that period with any real precision. I'd narrated it as loss, cataloged it as evidence of a particular kind of inadequacy, and then filed it away. What I started to see, slowly and with some resistance, was that the 4 years I'd called stagnant had actually produced something, not the thing I'd been aiming at, something else entirely, a particular quality of patience, a tolerance for uncertainty that I genuinely did not have before that period, a capacity to continue functioning with competence while internally holding a situation that had no resolution in sight. None of that had felt like growth while it was happening. It had felt like nothing was happening. But looking back from the kitchen table, with the cold tea and the refrigerator hum, and the careful attention I was finally paying to my own history, I could see the shape of it. And the shape was not a stagnant pool. It was a slow, invisible calibration. And what it had calibrated me for, I was only now beginning to understand. The moment I realized my perception had actually changed wasn't dramatic. It was deeply, almost insultingly ordinary. And that's exactly what made it impossible to dismiss. I was walking to get groceries, a route I had taken so many times it required zero conscious attention. My body knew the turns, the curbs, the particular timing of the lights, and somewhere on that walk, without any intention on my part, I noticed something I had walked past what must have been hundreds of times without ever registering, a pattern in the way 3 separate things were arranged. A cracked paving stone, a particular shadow from a building edge, the way a bird had landed at a precise angle on a wire overhead. None of it meant anything on its own, but the relationship between the 3 of them landed in me like a chord, complete and immediate. No reasoning process, no assembly required, just there, whole. I stopped walking, stood on the pavement with people moving past me on both sides, that particular urban sound of footsteps and distant traffic and someone's music leaking from earphones, and I understood, not theoretically but physically, what those kitchen table evenings had been pointing at. This was what the traditions meant, not magic, not revelation in any religious sense, just perception operating at a different layer, faster than thought, picking up structural relationships that analytical attention, moving linearly from point to point, would take minutes to assemble, and would probably still miss half of. My body had understood the pattern before my mind had even registered the components. I started paying attention to when this happened. It happened more than I expected, and the more I paid attention to it without trying to force it or explain it away, the more reliable it became. Information arrived differently, not always, not on demand, but with a consistency that started to feel less like accident and more like a faculty that had been there all along, running quietly in the background, largely ignored because I had been so thoroughly trained to trust only what I could trace through a linear chain of reasoning. I had been operating with one hand tied behind my back and calling it normal. The loosening I felt during this period is hard to describe without making it sound like losing something, but it wasn't loss exactly. It was more like the difference between carrying a bag that's been packed so tightly nothing can shift and carrying one with a little give in it. The tightly packed version feels secure. Nothing rattles, nothing moves. But you also can't add anything new, can't adjust to the terrain, can't reach in and find what you actually need without unpacking everything first. The version with a little give is less certain feeling, but it's alive in a way the packed one isn't. And I want to be precise here because this is the part that gets distorted most easily. easily. The loosening was not about becoming less functional. It was not about detaching from ordinary life or floating into some permanent soft focus state. I was still the same person, doing the same things in the same world. I was still showing up, still handling practical demands, still having conversations about completely unremarkable topics with completely ordinary coherence. But underneath all of that, the operating layer had shifted, and once you feel that shift, even slightly, you understand why every tradition that ever tried to describe it struggled to find accurate language, because the language we have was built for the tightly packed version. What I didn't expect, and this is the part that connects directly to what I need to tell you next, was how alone that would feel at first. And I mean alone in a very specific way, not lonely in the ordinary sense, not isolated from people, but alone in the sense of being, for the first time, genuinely unlocatable by the frameworks that everyone around me was using to make sense of each other, like being the only person in a room who can hear a frequency that everyone else's equipment isn't calibrated to receive. You can describe the sound. People will nod politely, but the nod is not recognition, and you know the difference. I had gotten further into this process than most people around me, not because I was more capable or more serious or more spiritually advanced in any meaningful sense, but simply because I had stayed present through a specific kind of discomfort long enough for something to shift. And that's the only honest explanation I have. There was no dramatic initiating event, no extraordinary experience that set me apart, just a quiet, unglamorous, largely invisible persistence through the phase where nothing seems to be happening, through the gray middle, through the Tuesday afternoons and the cold tea, and the kitchen table evenings where progress was completely invisible from the inside. And here's what I want you to understand about that, because this is not a minor point. This is actually the entire point. The people I watched retreat during this period were not less intelligent than me. They were not less sincere, not less capable, not less deserving of whatever clarity was on the other side of the process. They retreated because they underestimated the gray middle. They expected the shift to feel like something worth staying for before it revealed itself as something worth staying for. And that's the paradox at the center of all of this. You cannot know the value of the threshold until you have crossed it, but crossing it requires acting as if you already know. What I was only beginning to understand was just how much of what I thought I had built in those gray years had actually been deposited, quietly, without ceremony, and it was about to start paying out in ways I genuinely had no framework to anticipate. I woke up one morning and realized I genuinely could not remember what I used to want. Not in a poetic way, literally. I sat on the edge of my bed in the early gray light, the kind of morning where the world outside is still deciding whether to commit to the day, and I ran through the list of things I had previously identified as goals, ambitions, markers of a life going in the right direction, and they were all still there as concepts, but the pull behind them was gone, completely, like walking into a room where music had been playing and finding it silent without knowing when it stopped. This is the part I had not been warned about. All the kitchen table reading, all the careful attention to pattern and perception, all the slow accumulating understanding of what I was moving toward. None of it had prepared me for what moving away from the old version would actually feel like from the inside, because it didn't feel like liberation, not at first. It felt like a specific and unfamiliar kind of emptiness, the kind that isn't peaceful because it isn't chosen. It's just there, where the drive used to be. I want to name this precisely because I've talked to enough people since to know how commonly it gets misidentified. It gets called depression. It gets called burnout. It gets called a crisis of meaning, which is at least closer, but still misses the structural reality of what's happening. What's actually happening is that the motivational system that ran on the old operating layer has gone offline. The goals it was oriented toward no longer generate the signal that made them feel worth pursuing, and the new orientation hasn't completed forming yet. So you exist in the gap, functional, present, competent at the surface level, but internally running on something close to neutral. No forward pull, no backward pull either, which is actually significant. Just this wide, still, slightly unnerving open space where momentum used to live. The silence of that space is its own kind of communication, if you can resist the urge to fill it immediately. And that's the hard part, because everything in the surrounding world is oriented toward filling silence. Your phone fills it. Other people's energy fills it. The reflexive reaching for distraction fills it. And all of that filling is not malicious. It's just what a system trained on constant input does when input stops. It panics slightly, and goes looking for more. I had to learn, with more conscious effort than I expected, to just sit in it, to let the emptiness be empty, without immediately diagnosing it as a problem that needed solving. What I discovered when I did that, when I actually let the silence be what it was without rushing past it, was that it had a texture. It wasn't flat. It wasn't uniform. There were things moving in it, slowly, below the level of the old noise, quieter preferences, smaller, more honest impulses, things I actually found interesting rather than things I had trained myself to find appropriate to find interesting. The silence, it turned out, was not absence. It was the space the reorganization needed to work in. And the reorganization was working, just not on a timeline I could see from where I was standing. Now I need to tell you about the window, because this is where the timing piece becomes impossible to ignore, and I want to be careful about how I frame it, because I'm aware of how it sounds. There is a phase in this process where what you pay attention to carries disproportionate weight, not forever, not indefinitely, but during the period when the old patterns have loosened and the new ones haven't fully set. Your attention is essentially the primary variable. Whatever you consistently direct it toward during this window gets strengthened. Whatever you neglect gets left behind. And this is not mystical. It's closer to the way a muscle responds to use, or the way a path through tall grass appears and disappears, depending on whether people keep walking it. The mechanism is attention. The material it works on is the restructuring that's already underway. And the window exists because restructuring doesn't stay open indefinitely. At some point, the new configuration solidifies into the next baseline, and what got fed during the open period is what gets built in. I became intensely aware of this without fully having language for it during those weeks. I noticed that certain inputs left me feeling clearer, more coherent, more capable of the kind of perception I'd been developing, and others left me feeling like something had been slightly smudged. Not ruined, not dramatically disrupted, just less precise, like a lens that's been breathed on. And I started making choices based on that distinction, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, without building a system or a rule set around it, just noticing what clarified and moving toward more of it, noticing what smudged and reducing it where I could, small adjustments, barely visible from the outside. But the cumulative effect over those weeks was significant enough that when I looked back from the other side of that window, the person who had sat on the edge of the bed, unable to remember what he wanted, felt like someone I had visited rather than someone I had been. What I didn't understand yet was exactly how close I had come to losing the window entirely through a single, very specific, very human mistake that I almost made without realizing it. The mistake I almost made was telling someone about it too soon. I need to explain why that was almost catastrophic. Not because the person was unkind, not because they were unsupportive in any obvious way, but because the moment I started trying to put what was happening into words for someone else, something shifted in the wrong direction, and I felt it in real time, which is the only reason I caught it before it went too far. It was an evening at a friend's place. Warm light, the smell of food someone had cooked earlier still hanging in the air, that comfortable, low-level noise of a small group of people who know each other well enough to talk without performing. And at some point, the conversation turned to the kind of territory where this naturally wanted to surface. Someone said something about feeling stuck. Someone else said something about purpose. And I felt the pull to share what I'd been moving through. That specific social gravity that makes you want to bring something private into the room when the room seems ready for it. So I started talking, carefully at first, feeling my way into it. And I watched, with a clarity I hadn't expected, what happened to the experience as I tried to translate it. It started to flatten. The things that had felt three-dimensional and precise inside my own processing became thinner in the air between me and the other person. Not because my words were wrong exactly, but because the act of narrating it required me to step outside the experience and look at it from a social angle, to package it into something that could be received, responded to, evaluated. And in that packaging, something essential leaked out. I could feel it happening and I couldn't stop it, like trying to carry water in your hands. And then something worse happened. I got a reaction, a genuine, well-meaning, thoughtful reaction from someone who was actually trying to engage with what I was describing. And the reaction was like a hook in the experience. It gave the whole thing a social shape it hadn't had before. Now it wasn't just something I was living through, it was something I had described, something with an audience, something that could be agreed with or disagreed with, validated or questioned. And that transformation happened so fast I almost didn't register what had been lost in it. I stopped talking, fairly abruptly, made some excuse about losing the thread, and I sat there for the rest of that conversation with a very specific feeling. The feeling of having let cold air into a room that had been carefully the right temperature, not ruined, but altered, and requiring some quiet effort to restore. I thought about that evening for days afterward, about why it had gone that way, and what I slowly worked out was this. The process I was in was still forming, like something that needed to set before it could be moved, and bringing it into social space before it had set introduced a kind of pressure it wasn't ready for. Other people's frameworks, other people's interpretations, the subtle but real distortion of performing your own inner experience for an external audience. All of that had jostled something that needed stillness. And the lesson wasn't that you never talk about these things. The lesson was about sequence, about the difference between sharing something that is fully integrated and sharing something that is still in the process of becoming what it's going to be. One of those is generous. The other is destabilizing in a way that looks like openness, but functions like self-interruption. Now I need to tell you the thing that brought all of this into the sharpest focus, the thing that made me understand, with a precision I hadn't had before, that what I was moving through hadn't started where I thought it had. There was a particular afternoon when I was going through some old notebooks, not with any specific intention, just the kind of aimless sorting that happens when you're between things and your hands want something to do. And I found a notebook from roughly 6 years before that Tuesday afternoon, before the bookshop, before the kitchen table evenings, before any of it had a shape I recognized. And I opened it to a random page. What I found there stopped me completely. In handwriting I recognized as mine, but that felt like it belonged to someone slightly different, someone who hadn't yet learned to perform competence quite as fluently, was a paragraph describing a feeling, a low, persistent hum underneath the functioning, a sense of something not quite fitting, a question I couldn't name but couldn't stop running. It was, almost word for word, the same internal landscape I had described to myself as a Tuesday afternoon discovery, the same texture, the same frequency, 6 years earlier, in a notebook I had written in, and then apparently filed away and forgotten entirely. I sat with that notebook open in my lap for a long time. The light outside was changing, going from afternoon gold to the flatter gray of early evening, and I just sat there with the particular weight of realizing that I had been building towards something for far longer than my conscious narrative had accounted for. Every year I had read as stagnant. Every period I had categorized as time before it began had actually been part of it. The beginning hadn't been the bookshop. The beginning had been so far back I couldn't locate it precisely, which meant something that should have been unsettling but instead felt like solid ground under my feet for the first time in longer than I could easily measure. And it raised a question I hadn't asked yet. If all of that time had been contributing without my awareness, what else was contributing right now that I couldn't see yet? The mind doesn't announce when it's about to sabotage you. That's the whole mechanism. It just starts generating very reasonable-sounding thoughts. I noticed it first about 2 weeks after finding the notebook. Things had been moving well. The window I described was still open. I was making the small, consistent choices that fed clarity rather than noise, and something that felt like a new coherence was quietly forming underneath the day-to-day surface. And then, without any obvious trigger, the quality of my thinking shifted. Not dramatically, not into anything I would have flagged as a problem if I hadn't been paying close attention. It just started producing a particular kind of internal commentary, careful, measured, analytical, and relentlessly focused on whether any of this was real. The thoughts sounded like this. Maybe the notebook entry 6 years ago was a coincidence. Lots of people feel that kind of low-level dissatisfaction. It doesn't necessarily indicate a continuous process. Maybe the pattern recognition on the pavement was just my brain finding shapes the way brains always do. Maybe the whole kitchen table period was an elaborate intellectual distraction from something more practically pressing that I was avoiding dealing with. All of it delivered in a voice that sounded exactly like my own voice at its most reasonable, at its most grounded, at its most responsibly skeptical. And I want to be clear, those thoughts were not stupid. They were not obviously wrong. There was a version of each of them that was a legitimate question worth sitting with. But what I caught, after a day or two of letting them run, was the effect they were having. Not on my beliefs, on my attention. Because every time one of those thoughts came through and I engaged with it, turned it over, tried to answer it, my attention moved out of the present process and into a courtroom, into a space where the experience was on trial, and I was simultaneously the defendant, the prosecutor, and the judge. And nothing grows well in a courtroom. Nothing subtle or still or in the process of forming can survive that kind of atmosphere. This is what I now understand as rational sabotage, and it's the most seductive of the three forms because it wears the face of intelligence. It positions itself as the responsible alternative to credulity. It makes you feel like engaging with it is a sign of rigor. But what it's actually doing is redirecting your most precise attention away from the thing that needs it and toward an argument that can never fully resolve because it's not designed to resolve. It's designed to occupy. I stopped engaging with it, not by suppressing it, not by deciding the questions were invalid, but by noticing that I was in a courtroom and choosing to step outside, to return my attention to the present, to what was actually happening in my direct experience right now, rather than to the meta-level argument about whether my direct experience was trustworthy. And the thoughts didn't stop, but they lost their pull, like a radio playing in another room, present, audible, but no longer requiring a response. The second form arrived differently. It came through the body. A few days after the rational wave had lost its grip, I woke up with that specific tiredness that doesn't come from not sleeping enough, the kind that sits behind the eyes and makes everything feel slightly more effortful than it should. And with it came a flatness, not the productive emptiness I had learned to sit in, something heavier, more discouraging, a faint but persistent sense that the whole process was probably more than I had the energy for, that the clarity I had been building was fragile and temporary, and would require more consistent effort to maintain than I was realistically capable of sustaining. This was emotional sabotage, and where the rational version had been sharp and argumentative, this one was soft and heavy and wore the costume of honesty. Because it wasn't saying the process was wrong, it was saying I was probably not quite enough for it. And that is a much harder thing to argue with than a logical objection, because it targets something below the level where argument operates. It targets the felt sense of your own capacity. And if it lands, it doesn't produce a debate. It produces a slow, quiet withdrawal that you can easily mistake for maturity, for realistic self-assessment, for knowing your limits. I caught it by noticing the texture. Real tiredness has an honest quality to it. It asks for rest and responds to rest. What I was feeling didn't respond to rest. I slept well and woke up with it still sitting there, unchanged, which told me it wasn't coming from the body. It was coming from somewhere that rest couldn't reach. And that distinction, small as it sounds, was everything. Because once I identified it accurately, I could respond to it accurately, not by pushing through with force, but by continuing to make the small choices that fed coherence without requiring that I feel energized while doing it. Discipline without mood as a prerequisite. Continuing not because it felt good, but because the direction was still clear, even when the energy behind it had temporarily drained. And then the third form arrived, the one I had been least prepared for, the one that nearly worked. The third form of sabotage didn't come from inside my own head. It came wearing the face of someone I trusted. I need to set this up carefully because the the details matter. By this point, I had navigated the rational wave and the emotional drainage, and something in me had steadied, not triumphantly, quietly, the way a room settles after a door that had been rattling in the wind finally closes properly. And in that steadiness, I had started to notice something new in how I was moving through ordinary days. A different quality of decision-making, less noise in the process, less of that exhausting internal negotiation between what I wanted and what I thought I was supposed to want. Things that had previously required effort to choose were becoming simpler, not easier in the sense of requiring less courage, but cleaner, like the signal had gotten clearer and the static between intention and action had thinned. And then I had lunch with someone I'd known for a long time, someone whose judgment I had historically respected, someone who knew enough of my history to have real context. We were at a place we'd been to before, that particular kind of midday light through wide windows, the background noise of other people's conversations, creating just enough cover that you can speak honestly without feeling exposed. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, I made the mistake I had learned about weeks earlier. I started talking about what I'd been moving through, not because I'd forgotten the lesson of the first time, but because this felt different. This was someone who knew me. This was safe. It wasn't safe in the way I needed it to be. And again, not because of any unkindness, but because what came back across the table was concern. Genuine, caring, well-intentioned concern, expressed in the language of people who love you and don't want to watch you disappear into something they can't follow. Phrases like, "You've been very internal lately. Are you sure you're not just avoiding something real? I just want to make sure you're being practical." And underneath all of it, that specific social pressure that doesn't announce itself as pressure. The pressure of someone important to you needing you to be recognizable, needing the version of you they have a relationship with to remain available and legible and within reach. I felt it land. That's the only honest way to describe it, not as argument, as weight, a particular kind of relational gravity that pulls you back toward the shape you held in someone else's picture of you. And for a moment, sitting there with the food getting slightly cold between us, I felt the pull to give them what they needed, to reframe what I was describing as something smaller, something more ordinary, something that fit the available category of going through a phase. And then I caught it, the same way I had caught the other two, by noticing the texture of what was happening in me rather than the content of what was being said. Because what I felt in that moment of almost giving in wasn't relief. It was a particular kind of shrinking, a familiar compression, the specific internal sensation of making yourself smaller to fit a space that was never sized for what you actually are. And I had felt that sensation so many times before, across so many years, that I recognized it instantly. It was the sensation I had been slowly, carefully, unglamorously learning to stop producing. And here it was again, in a lunch conversation with someone who cared about me, dressed up as reasonableness. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I said something gentle and shifted the conversation. And I sat with what had happened all the way home. The particular quiet of someone processing something they don't yet have full language for. The city moving past me in that slightly abstracted way it does when your attention is mostly somewhere internal. What I understood by the time I got back was this: the people in your life are not obstacles to this process, but they are also not always able to accompany you through every part of it. And the love they have for you can sometimes operate as a kind of anchor, not maliciously, not intentionally, but structurally, because real change in one person requires a renegotiation with everyone who has a stake in who that person has been. And that renegotiation cannot be rushed, explained, or performed. It can only be demonstrated over time, through the quiet, consistent evidence of a different way of being in the world. That understanding settled something in me, not easily, but thoroughly. And what came after it was the phase I had least expected and most needed. The phase where everything I had been moving through stopped feeling like a process I was inside and started feeling like a ground I was standing on, not arrived, not finished, but genuinely different from the person who had sat in the gray Tuesday silence, wondering what had happened to what he used to want. And the way that shift announced itself was so small and so ordinary that I almost missed it, which is exactly, I've come to understand, how the real ones always arrive. The thing that finally showed me I had actually changed wasn't a feeling. It was the absence of one I used to have constantly. I was in a situation that 6 months earlier would have produced a very specific internal response. The kind of situation where something is being asked of you that doesn't align with what you actually think is right. Asked by someone whose opinion of you carries social weight. Asked in a context where the path of least resistance is obvious, and the cost of taking it seems small enough to justify. I had navigated hundreds of versions of this situation before, and my historical pattern was consistent. A brief, internal friction, a rapid calculation of what the agreement would cost versus what the resistance would cost, and then a quiet, competent, slightly self-betraying compliance, followed by that specific, low-grade discomfort that never fully resolved because it wasn't supposed to resolve. It was supposed to remind me that I had made a trade I didn't fully endorse. This time, the friction wasn't there. Not because the situation was easier, it wasn't, but because the calculation that used to happen so automatically, I barely noticed it, simply didn't run. There was just a clarity about what I actually thought, and a response that came from that clarity, without the usual negotiation process between what I knew and what I was willing to say I knew. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. The other person registered something had shifted in me. I could see it in the slight recalibration of their expression. And then the moment passed, and the conversation moved on. But I carried it with me for the rest of the day. Not triumphantly. More like the feeling of realizing you have been walking differently for a while, without consciously deciding to change your gait. This is what I now understand integration to actually mean. Not a permanent elevated state. Not immunity to difficulty or confusion, or the ordinary grinding demands of being a person in the world, but a different default position. A new resting point that the system returns to after disturbance, the way a compass needle swings, and then settles back to north. The north hadn't changed, but the settling was faster, quieter, less expensive, and the thing that struck me most about it was how unglamorous it looked from the outside. Nobody would have looked at that 30-second moment in that conversation and seen anything significant. It didn't look like transformation. It looked like a person responding to a situation with unremarkable composure. But I knew what was underneath it. I knew what it had taken to build the ground that made that composure possible. I thought about all the voices I had encountered during this period that had tried to sell me a different version of what this process would look like. The ones that described awakening in the language of arrival, of elevation, of becoming something other than ordinary. And I understood now, with a completeness I hadn't had before, why that framing is not just inaccurate, but actively harmful, because it sets up an expectation that keeps you looking in the wrong direction. You spend your energy scanning for the dramatic signal, while the actual shift is happening in the quiet, unremarkable 30-second moments that don't make good stories. The compass needle settling, the calculation not running, the response coming clean. These are the things. These have always been the things. I also understood something about the voices themselves, about any source of guidance, any framework, any transmission that presents itself as the access point to something you couldn't reach without it. The honest ones make themselves unnecessary over time. That's the signature. If you've been engaging with something genuine, you should be needing it less at the end of a period than you did at the beginning. Not because you've consumed all it has to offer, but because what it was actually pointing at was never outside you to begin with. It was always your own capacity to see clearly, returning to itself as the accumulated distortion thinned. Any voice that positions itself as permanently essential is not pointing at your clarity. It is positioning itself between you and it, and the difference between those two things is everything. This is where the story brings me to now, and this is where it becomes yours as much as mine. Because everything I have described, the Tuesday silence, the crack in the bookshop, the kitchen table evenings, the gray years that turned out to be calibration, the window, the 3 forms that tried to pull me back, the notebook with the 6-year-old handwriting, the lunch conversation, the 30-second moment with the compass settling, none of it is unique to me. The specific texture is mine, the particular sequence of events is mine, but the structure underneath it is something I have now seen enough times in enough different people to know it is not personal. It is a pattern, and patterns are recognizable. Which means, if you have been feeling, at any point during this account, that low hum of recognition I described in the very beginning, that is not coincidence, and it is not projection. That is the part of you that has already been in this process, quietly, for longer than your conscious story has accounted for, recognizing its own shape in someone else's description of it. Here is what I want to leave you with, not as advice, as the single most useful reframe I found across this entire period. The question most people bring to this kind of process is, am I ready? And that question will keep you waiting indefinitely, because readiness, defined as the complete absence of doubt and fear and resistance, never arrives. The question that actually moves something is different. It is, am I willing to continue being honest, even when honesty costs me comfort, even when nobody is watching, even when the return on it is not yet visible? That is the whole thing. That is the gate and the path and the destination compressed into a single, repeated daily choice. Not grand, not dramatic, just honest, consistently, without an audience. The 30-second moments are where it lives, not in the revelations, in the small, clean, unremarkable choices that nobody sees but you, and you have been making some version of them for longer than you know. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually sit with it before you answer. Think about the last time you knew exactly what the honest response was and chose the easier one instead. Not because you were weak, but because the cost of the honest one felt too high in that particular moment. How long ago was that? And more importantly, what did that choice cost you that you haven't fully added up yet? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. And if this account landed somewhere real for you, if any part of it felt like it was describing something you already knew but hadn't quite found words for, then hit the like button and subscribe. Not for the numbers, because it tells me this kind of honest, unhurried conversation is worth continuing, and I think it is.